The official record says 43 patients. The burial ledger says 44 bodies. The surviving admission book lists only one name. In March of 1893, an asylum burned. The flames consumed wood, iron, human flesh. When investigators arrived at the smoking foundation, they found contradictions that shouldn't exist in a modern institution. A fire can destroy records. But it cannot explain why the admission ledger, recovered intact from a fireproof safe, contained entries for 43 patients, while the county coroner documented 44 bodies pulled from the ruins. And it cannot explain why, when researchers opened that ledger decades later, they found that 42 names had been methodically removed, scraped away, overwritten, blacked out with India ink so thoroughly that not even modern forensic photography could recover what lay beneath. Only one patient remained in the record, a woman, no first name recorded, just an initial, a date, and a single word in the attending physician's hand. Retained. The pages before her entry? Gone. The pages after? Gone. But her entry remained untouched, as if someone decided she alone deserved to be remembered. Or perhaps that she alone could never be allowed to disappear. This is not a ghost story. This is an investigation into what institutional memory chooses to erase, and what, despite every attempt, it cannot. 1893 was the year the world learned that progress had limits. In May, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. Within weeks, 158 national banks failed. Factories shuttered. Railroads went into receivership. Unemployment surged from 3% to 12% in 6 months. By summer, breadlines stretched through American cities, and the institutions designed to care for society's most vulnerable found themselves overcrowded, underfunded, and desperate. Asylums were already warehouses by this point. The idealistic vision of moral treatment, sunlit rooms, therapeutic labor, gardens designed to calm troubled minds, had given way to brick corridors packed with bodies. County asylums built for 300 patients now held 800. State legislatures slashed budgets, staff fled for better work, and fires became common. Not accidental fires, not always, but fires that solved problems. Overcrowding, scandal, budgetary pressure. A building burns, the patients scatter or die, and the records, those heavy leather-bound ledgers documenting who was committed, why, and by whom, those records go up in smoke. Convenient, except when the records don't burn. When a fireproof safe does exactly what it was designed to do, preserving the one piece of evidence that reveals more through its erasures than it ever did through its entries. The asylum we're investigating sat in a northeastern county. Its name has been lost, not to fire, but to administrative reorganization and the quiet destruction of supplementary documents in the 1930s. But the ledger survived. One ledger. One patient. And the question that led us here, why? Asylum records were supposed to be permanent. The Lunacy Act of 1845 mandated that every institution maintain an admission book, a contemporary record documenting each patient's name, age, diagnosis, and outcome. These weren't suggestions. They were legal requirements, inspected by county magistrates and state commissioners. The ledgers themselves were built to last. Leather bindings, heavy rag paper, iron locks. Many were stored in fireproof safes after a series of suspicious fires in the 1860s made it clear that institutional memory was fragile or deliberately vulnerable. By 1893, the system should have been foolproof. It wasn't, because the ledgers recorded more than medical information. They recorded who committed patients, wealthy men institutionalizing inconvenient wives, families disposing of epileptic children, employers removing laborers who'd become too ill to work, magistrates clearing streets of immigrants who didn't speak English. The ledger was a map of power, and maps can be redrawn. Standard practice called for entries in chronological order by admission date, indexed alphabetically in a separate book. Patient names, ages, place of birth, diagnosis, date of discharge or death. Simple. Transparent. But there were gaps in the system. Entries could be made in pencil first, then overwritten in ink. Pages could be removed if deemed administratively redundant. Amendments could be noted in margins, then the margins themselves trimmed during rebinding. By the time an asylum closed, whether through fire, bankruptcy, or state takeover, its records often resembled Swiss cheese. Holes everywhere. And officials would shrug, lost to time, lost to fire, lost to neglect. But this wasn't neglect. This was surgery. March of 1893 arrived cold. The economic collapse that began in May was already casting shadows. Banks were quietly calling in loans. Factories were reducing shifts. Asylum administrators were reading budget reports with growing dread, knowing that when money disappeared, the first cuts would be to food, heat, and staffing. The patient population, meanwhile, continued to grow. Not because mental illness was increasing, but because families and municipalities had nowhere else to put people. Asylums had become dumping grounds for the poor, the immigrant, the elderly, the epileptic, the alcoholic, anyone who didn't fit into an industrializing society that demanded able bodies and compliant behavior. One asylum superintendent wrote in his annual report, "We are no longer a hospital. We are a human warehouse, and the inventory keeps expanding." Overcrowding created danger. Wooden structures built to house 50 patients now held 200. Heating systems designed for manageable loads were pushed beyond capacity. Gas lighting, oil lamps, and candles proliferated in poorly ventilated corridors. The commissioners in lunacy issued warnings. They documented institutions where temporary wooden annexes, constructed quickly to handle overflow, sat next to furnace rooms. They noted inadequate fire escapes, locked wards, barred windows. The warnings were filed, the annexes remained. And on March 9, 1893, in a county asylum whose name no longer officially exists, something ignited. The fire consumed the main building in under 2 hours. 44 people died. The structure was declared a total loss. But the safe, installed after an earlier fire scare in 1888, survived. Inside, one ledger. Intact. Except it wasn't intact. It had been edited. Before the fire. When the county magistrate opened the fireproof safe 3 days after the fire, he expected to find comprehensive records. He found evidence of a cover-up. The admission ledger was there, its leather binding scorched but intact. The pages, though smoke-stained, were readable, but where there should have been 43 entries corresponding to the 43 patients the asylum claimed to house, there was one. One name. One entry. One patient who, according to the ledger, was the sole occupant of an institution built for hundreds. The magistrate's initial report is preserved in county archives. His handwriting grows more agitated as the document progresses. The ledger appears to have been tampered with prior to the fire. Evidence of erasure is visible throughout. Chemical agents, likely lye solution or oxalic acid, were applied to remove ink. In some sections, the paper itself has been scraped thin with a blade. The binding shows signs of pages removed, though the stitching was carefully repaired to disguise the gaps. But that wasn't the only problem. The index book, the alphabetical reference that should have accompanied the admission ledger, was missing entirely. Not burned, not damaged, just absent from the safe, despite testimony from staff that it had been stored there as recently as February. And the burial records? The coroner's office reported 44 bodies recovered from the ruins. But when they requested the asylum's death registry to match names to remains, they were told no such registry existed. 44 people died in that fire. The state has no official record of who they were, except one. But this world of missing documents, economic collapse, and institutional desperation couldn't explain what came next. The asylum was never supposed to be permanent. Constructed in 1868 as a temporary solution to overcrowding in the state hospital system, it was a wood-frame structure reinforced with brick facades. 2 stories, 40 rooms. Capacity, 60 patients. It was meant to operate for 5 years while a proper Kirkbride-planned facility was built nearby. 25 years later, it was still standing. Still operating. Still temporary. The building sat on 12 acres outside the county seat. Close enough to town for supply deliveries. Far enough that neighbors wouldn't complain about screams. Surrounded by farmland that patients worked as part of therapeutic labor, which meant free agricultural work for the county while the asylum paid for their upkeep. Photographs from 1890 show long, dim corridors. Gas fixtures mounted every 20 feet, casting weak yellow light. Wooden floors worn smooth by decades of shuffling feet. Windows barred with iron, some boarded over entirely. The commissioner's report from 1891 described conditions as adequate but declining. Translation: it was a fire trap, but there was no money to replace it. The superintendent from 1887 to 1893 was Dr. Edmund Carver, a physician with no formal training in mental illness, common for the era. Asylum superintendents were general practitioners who took the position for steady pay. Carver's surviving correspondence reveals a man overwhelmed by administrative duties, frustrated by budget cuts, and increasingly desperate to reduce the patient census by any means necessary. One letter to the county board dated January 1893 reads, "We cannot continue operations under present appropriations. Either the patient population must be reduced or the inevitable will occur." 2 months later, the building burned. The inevitable occurred. Asylum patients in 1893 were rarely what we'd call mentally ill. Court records from surrounding counties reveal commitment patterns. A woman hospitalized for reading excessively. A man committed for religious enthusiasm. Immigrants institutionalized because they caused disturbance through foreign speech. Elderly people whose families could no longer afford their care. Epileptics. Alcoholics. The intellectually disabled. And women. So many women. A man could commit his wife with nothing more than his word and a cooperative physician's signature. No hearing, no representation. Just a certificate stating she was of unsound mind and she'd disappear into the asylum system, sometimes for life. The admission criteria were vague enough to encompass almost anyone. Melancholia, mania, moral insanity. Diagnoses that could mean anything from genuine psychosis to inconvenient behavior. Class determined everything. Wealthy patients went to private facilities with gardens, libraries, and individual care. The poor went to county asylums like this one, where dozens shared rooms designed for 6, where treatment meant restraint and sedation, where the primary goal was containment. The surviving county budget records show what the asylum spent per patient in 1893, 17 cents per day. For food, clothing, heat, medical care, everything, 17 cents. Staff turnover was constant. Attendants earned $8 per month, barely above poverty wages. They worked 12-hour shifts with minimal training and no oversight. Violence against patients was routine. Sexual assault went unreported. When patients died, and they died frequently, the bodies were buried in numbered graves on asylum grounds. No headstones, no names, just numbers. This was the system. Brutal, efficient, invisible, and deeply invested in remaining invisible. By 1893, asylum scandals were a genre of journalism. Nellie Bly's 1887 exposé of Blackwell's Island had shocked the nation. She'd gone undercover as a patient and documented horrific conditions. Spoiled food, freezing water baths, violent attendants, women tied to benches for days. When a grand jury visited to investigate, the asylum had been tipped off. Witnesses were transferred. The facility was scrubbed clean. Staff denied everything, but the jury believed Bly. Nearly $1 million was added to the departmental budget for reforms. The reforms didn't reach smaller county asylums. They remained what they'd always been: hidden, underfunded, lethal. And when problems arose, patient deaths, staff brutality, financial mismanagement, the solution was often the same: destroy the evidence. In 1890, the Milwaukee County Asylum reported that all records prior to 1880 had been lost in a reorganization. Decades of patient documentation, gone. When researchers decades later discovered the records in a basement storage room, perfectly intact, asylum administrators had no explanation. In 1891, the Strafford County Asylum in New Hampshire was condemned by state inspectors as a fire hazard. The wooden structure was overcrowded, poorly heated, and lacked adequate exits. The county delegation promised repairs. The repairs never happened. On March 9, 1893, the same date as our fire, the Strafford County Asylum burned. 41 patients died. The investigation found that county officials had been guilty of allowing to exist and maintaining, after official warning, a building totally unfit for its purpose. No one was prosecuted. The pattern was clear. Institutions ignored warnings, patients died, records disappeared, and officials expressed regret while avoiding accountability. But our asylum was different, because someone prepared for the fire. Someone edited the ledger before the flames arrived. Someone decided that 42 patients would be erased from history, and 1 would remain. The admission ledger now sits in a state archive, stored in climate-controlled conditions, available only to researchers with specific clearance. It's a standard institutional ledger. Leather binding, 14 inches tall, 9 inches wide, 3 inches thick, 400 pages, though many are missing. The cover bears the asylum's name, scratched out so thoroughly that even ultraviolet examination can't recover it, and dates 1887 to 1893. Inside, the pages tell a story of systematic erasure. The first 50 pages, removed entirely. The binding stitches were cut, the pages extracted, then the binding professionally repaired. Whoever did this had bookbinding tools and skill. Pages 51 through 200, treated with chemical agents. Modern analysis detected lyoxalic acid and ferric chloride, substances used to remove iron-based inks. In some sections, the paper is so thin it's nearly translucent. Names, dates, diagnoses, scrubbed away. But here's what's strange. The erasures aren't uniform. Some names were carefully removed with precision, leaving the surrounding text intact. Others were obliterated, entire sections blacked out with India ink, making them irretrievable. A few entries were physically scraped away with a blade, removing not just the ink but layers of paper fiber. Different methods, different timelines, as if someone returned to this ledger multiple times, each time eliminating different information. And then, on page 212, the erasures stop. One entry remains untouched as if preserved intentionally. Patient 187, March 2, 1893, female, age unknown, diagnosis retained, admission, county order, physician, E. Carver, no first name, no last name, just retained. That's not a diagnosis, that's not a symptom. It's an administrative note, something you'd write about a document, not a human being. As if she wasn't a patient at all, as if she was evidence. And what researchers found beneath her entry, pressed between the pages invisible until the binding was carefully separated, made no sense. A photograph, small, damaged, showing the interior of a room that shouldn't exist. The county magistrate who opened the safe wasn't expecting a mystery. He was expecting a tragedy. 43 patients dead, probably due to negligence, maybe due to budget cuts. The kind of disaster that would lead to a coroner's inquest, some reprimands, maybe a criminal negligence charge if someone pushed hard enough. What he found was evidence that someone had anticipated the fire. His official report, filed March 15, 1893, includes this passage. The admission ledger recovered from the safe shows extensive alteration. Entries have been removed using chemical means, physical scraping, and in some cases complete page extraction. The alterations appear recent, weeks, not months. The index book, which staff confirm was stored alongside the admission ledger, is missing. No burial registry was found despite legal requirements. The magistrate called for an investigation. The investigation was assigned to the county sheriff, who had been appointed by the same board that oversaw the asylum budget. The sheriff's report, filed 2 weeks later, concluded, records damaged by fire and smoke. No evidence of criminal activity. But the ledger hadn't been damaged by fire. It had been edited before the fire, while stored in a safe, specifically designed to protect documents from flames. The magistrate pushed back. His follow-up letter to the state attorney general reads, I must register strong objection to the sheriff's findings. The physical evidence contradicts his conclusions. I request state intervention. The state attorney general's office responded 6 weeks later. Insufficient evidence to warrant further action. Matter considered closed. The magistrate resigned his position 4 months later. His resignation letter, preserved in county records, contains one final statement. I will not be complicit in the burial of truth alongside the burial of bodies. He never spoke publicly about the case again. But he kept copies of the documents. Those copies are why we know anything at all. Modern forensic document analysis has revealed something the 1893 investigators couldn't have known. The ledger wasn't just edited, it was reconstructed. Researchers using spectral imaging discovered that page 211, the page immediately before patient 187's entry, had been completely replaced, not removed and reinserted, replaced with a new page, carefully aged to match the surrounding paper, bound into the ledger with matching thread. The replacement page is blank except for one line of text, end of current admissions. But fiber analysis shows that page 211 was created using paper manufactured in 1894 or later, at least a year after the fire. Someone came back to this ledger after the disaster and inserted a false page to separate patient 187 from whatever came before her. Why go to such lengths? Why not simply remove her entry along with the others? Spectral imaging provides a clue. Under ultraviolet light, the page before patient 187, page 210, shows faint impressions from writing that once existed on the removed page above it. The pressure of pen on paper leaves indentations that survive even when the page itself is gone. The impressions are fragmentary, but enough is visible to reconstruct parts of what was written. Direct order from, cannot be released under, expense charged to, and one phrase, written with enough pressure that it pressed through multiple pages. State authority supersedes. Whatever patient 187 was, whatever reason she was retained, it involved direct state intervention. Someone with authority beyond the county level wanted her held in that asylum. And when the asylum burned, they wanted her entry preserved, while everything else disappeared. The photograph discovered pressed between pages 212 and 213 has been dated through chemical analysis to approximately 1890 to 1893. It's small, roughly 3 by 4 inches, a tin-type print, common for the period. The image is damaged, partly obscured by water damage and adhesion to the ledger pages, but what remains is disturbing. It shows a room, not a typical asylum ward with rows of beds, but something else. A small, windowless space, possibly in a basement, stone walls, a single cot, no other furniture, a door visible in the background with what appears to be external bolt hardware. Architectural historians who examined the photograph noted features inconsistent with standard asylum design. The walls show evidence of sound-dampening material, possibly corkboard or heavy fabric, mounted between wooden framing. The door is reinforced, designed not to keep someone out, but to keep someone in under conditions beyond normal asylum security. This wasn't a patient room. It was a cell. But here's what made researchers pause. The photograph includes a detail that shouldn't exist in an 1893 county asylum. In the upper corner of the room, barely visible in the damaged photograph, there's a small viewing port set into the wall. Similar to ports used in modern isolation facilities, but decades before such architectural features became standard. Someone designed this room for long-term observation and containment. Someone photographed it, and someone hid that photograph inside the ledger pressed against patient 187's entry, as if to document what couldn't be written in words. The question becomes, was the photograph hidden to preserve evidence or to hide it? And where in the asylum was this room located? Because when the building burned, investigators documented the foundation. They mapped every basement space, every storage room, every patient ward. No room matching the photograph appears in their records. In the weeks following the fire, investigators interviewed surviving staff members. 3 attendants, 1 nurse, and the assistant administrator gave testimony. Their accounts, preserved in county records, are strikingly consistent, which itself raises questions. All 5 confirmed that the asylum housed 43 patients on March 9th. All 5 provided identical estimates of patient locations when the fire started. All 5 stated they had never seen the admission ledger, as only Dr. Carver and the head administrator had access to the fireproof safe. But one attendant, a man named Thomas Webb, employed at the asylum for 7 years, added something else. In his written statement filed March 20th, he wrote, "There was a patient we didn't speak of. She wasn't counted in the census. She was kept separate in a room we were told never to enter. Dr. Carver handled her care personally. I don't know her name." When investigators followed up, asking Webb to elaborate, he revised his statement. The new version, filed March 25th, reads, "I misspoke in my previous testimony. I was confused. There was no such patient." Webb resigned from asylum work 1 month later and left the county. Researchers have been unable to locate any further records of his life. The other 4 staff members were asked directly, had they ever known of a patient kept in isolation, separate from the general population? All 4 said no. But when researchers examined payroll records decades later, they found something interesting. Beginning in January 1892, the asylum added a line item to its monthly expenses: special dietary provision, restricted access. The expenditure continued every month until March 1893. The amount, enough to feed one person. The budget category, charged directly to state accounts, not county funds. Someone was being held in that asylum at state expense, requiring special provisions, hidden from standard census counts. Except the page wasn't torn out, it was replaced. The 1890 United States Census included a special schedule, defective, dependent, and delinquent classes. Asylums were required to report all patients in residence on June 1, 1890. The returns included names, ages, diagnoses, and length of confinement. Our asylum reported 49 patients. But here's the problem. When researchers cross-referenced the census data with surviving county commitment records, they found court orders for 48 patients who should have been in the asylum in June 1890. 48 documented commitments. 49 reported in the census. 1 extra patient. No commitment record. No name in the county index. The 1893 fire destroyed most of the asylum's internal records, but the federal census survived. And that census, that external documentation, provides evidence that someone was being held in that institution without proper legal documentation. Holding a patient without court order was a crime in 1893. It was also surprisingly common, especially for patients whose families paid privately or who were committed under state authority for reasons beyond county jurisdiction. But the unnamed patient in the census, listed only as female, age unknown, diagnosis, under state care, appears in the exact year that someone began making monthly payments from state accounts for special dietary provision. And exactly 3 years later, in March 1893, patient 187, described only as retained, was entered into a ledger that someone then carefully edited to remove all surrounding context. The timeline suggests something that makes investigators deeply uncomfortable. Patient 187 may have been held in that asylum for at least 3 years without proper documentation, under state authority, in conditions requiring special containment. And what they found under the binding made no sense. When conservators separated the ledger's binding for preservation work, they discovered something pressed into the spine itself, a small piece of paper, folded many times, inscribed with a single sentence in Dr. Carver's handwriting, "I am not responsible for this." This wasn't the only asylum to lose its records at a convenient moment. In 1896, just 3 years after our fire, another disaster struck. This one methodical and bureaucratic. The 1890 United States Census included special schedules documenting institutionalized populations, prisons, asylums, poorhouses. These schedules contain names, diagnoses, and institutional details for hundreds of thousands of people. A fire in 1896 damaged some schedules. They were destroyed rather than preserved. A larger fire in 1921 destroyed most of what remained. And in the 1930s, the surviving fragments, representing decades of institutional records, were quietly destroyed by government order. The official reason: space constraints and privacy concerns. The result: nearly complete erasure of institutional populations from the historical record. If you were committed to an asylum, imprisoned, or placed in a poorhouse during the 1890s, there's a strong chance no federal record of your existence survives. Local records were supposed to fill the gap, but local records burned, flooded, or lost during reorganization, or were deliberately destroyed. The pattern repeats across the country. Institutions that should have comprehensive records have fragments, gaps, silences. And when researchers ask why, the answer is always the same: time, negligence, accident. But the Milwaukee County Insane Asylum reveals a different truth. In the 1920s, researchers were told all records prior to 1940 had been destroyed. For decades, historians accepted this. Then, in the 2000s, a hospital renovation uncovered boxes in a basement storage room. Inside, admission ledgers from 1880, case files with photographs, staff records, burial registries. Everything they'd been told was destroyed had been sitting in a basement for 80 years. Someone hadn't destroyed the records, they'd hidden them. And when asked why, current administrators had no answer. On March 9, 1893, the exact date of our fire, another asylum burned. The Strafford County Insane Asylum in Dover, New Hampshire. Wooden construction, overcrowded, condemned by state inspectors 2 years earlier as a fire hazard. The warnings were ignored. 41 patients died. Only 3 survived. The investigation revealed systematic negligence. County officials had been explicitly warned in 1883 that the building was unfit for its purpose. They'd promised repairs. The repairs never happened. Instead, the patient population increased, wooden annexes were added, and the asylum operated for another decade under conditions everyone knew were lethal. When the fire came, patients trapped in locked wards burned alive. Staff fled. The building collapsed in under 2 hours. The state investigation found officials guilty of allowing to exist and maintaining, after official warning, a building totally unfit for its purpose. No one was prosecuted. But here's what makes this fire relevant to our investigation. The Strafford County records. After the fire, the county reported that all admission records had been destroyed. Complete loss. No way to identify victims. 20 years later, a researcher found the admission ledger in a state archive. Not destroyed. Not damaged by fire. Transferred to state custody 2 weeks before the fire, along with financial records that would have documented the county's negligence. Someone anticipated the disaster. Someone moved the records that would prove official culpability. Then they claimed those records had burned. The Strafford County fire happened on the same day, in the same year, under the same conditions as our fire. Both asylums were overcrowded, condemned, and operating wooden structures known to be fire hazards. Both fires led to claims of destroyed records. But in both cases, records survived, edited, relocated, or hidden, but survived. The question is why? And the answer seems to be, because someone needed evidence to disappear while maintaining plausible deniability. You don't destroy records. You claim they were destroyed, then hide them where only someone with authority could access them later. In 1887, journalist Nellie Bly had herself committed to Blackwell's Island Asylum. What she documented changed asylum reform in America. Patients tied to benches for days, freezing baths, spoiled food, brutal staff, women committed by husbands who wanted them gone, held indefinitely without recourse. When her exposé published, officials promised a grand jury investigation. The asylum was notified in advance. By the time the jury arrived, the facility had been transformed. Witnesses had been transferred or released. The building was scrubbed. Fresh food appeared. Violent staff members were given leave. Asylum administrators denied everything. They claimed Bly had exaggerated, that conditions were always humane, that patient testimony couldn't be trusted because patients were, by definition, unreliable. But the jury believed Bly. Reforms were ordered. Funding increased. What didn't change was the system's fundamental approach to evidence. When scandal threatened, institutions didn't reform. They performed reform while hiding evidence of ongoing abuse. Patient testimony was dismissed as delusion. Staff who spoke honestly were fired. Records that documented mistreatment were lost or damaged. The Belgian-Aver affair in 1871 exposed arbitrary confinement and abuse in mental institutions. Laws changed. Oversight increased, but the abuse continued, hidden behind better documentation practices that made it harder to prove wrongdoing. By 1893, asylums had learned. You don't destroy all the records. You destroy the ones that prove guilt while keeping the ones that suggest everything was proper. You create a paper trail that shows compliance, while the real truth, the names of patients held illegally, the details of abuse, the evidence of institutional corruption, disappears into gaps that can be explained as accidents. File damage, reorganization, budget cuts that eliminate archival staff. Our ledger fits this pattern perfectly. It survived the fire, proving the institution maintained proper records. But the contents were edited, removing evidence of something that needed to remain hidden. All that remained was patient 187. One entry, one nameless woman marked as retained. Not evidence of a crime. Evidence that someone wanted to preserve just enough information to answer questions while revealing nothing. The truth lies somewhere in what's missing. Why would an asylum deliberately erase 42 patients while preserving one? The answer lies in understanding what asylum records actually documented. They weren't medical files. They were legal documents proving the state's authority to detain citizens. Every admission required a court order or physician's certificate. Every patient's presence had to be justified to county boards who controlled funding. When those justifications were questionable, when patients were held longer than legally allowed, or committed without proper documentation, or kept despite recovery because they were useful laborers, the records became liabilities. Budget records from 1893 show our asylum was operating beyond capacity, 43 patients officially, possibly more unofficially. County asylums were paid per patient by the county, but that funding was contingent on proper documentation. Patients held at state expense, like the unnamed woman in the 1890 census, bypassed county oversight. If you wanted to hold someone outside normal legal channels, you'd need state authority, and you'd need to hide their presence from county audits. The economic panic of 1893 created pressure. When banks failed and budgets collapsed, counties started demanding accountability. Asylum superintendents who couldn't justify their patient populations faced investigations. Dr. Carver's January 1893 letter warned the county board, reduce the population or face disaster. 2 months later, the building burned. Here's one possibility. The fire was an accident, but someone saw an opportunity. A disaster eliminates the patient population and creates cover for destroying records that would reveal illegal detentions, missing persons, or financial fraud. You edit the ledger before investigators arrive. Remove evidence of problem patients. Claim the index book and burial registry were lost in the fire. But you preserve one entry to prove you maintained proper records. One patient whose presence was legally authorized, whose detention wouldn't raise questions. Patient 187, retained by state authority. The one entry that could survive scrutiny. There's another explanation, darker in its implications. What if patient 187 wasn't preserved despite the erasures? What if she was the reason for them? Consider the sequence. Someone edits the ledger, removing 42 entries. Then they insert a blank page marked End of Current Admissions. Then patient 187's entry. Then they hide a photograph of an isolation cell and a note reading, I am not responsible for this. That's not concealment. That's documentation. Someone was creating a record that would survive, pointing to a specific patient while obscuring everyone around her. As if to say, when you investigate this fire, when you ask who died, look here. Not at the 42 erased names. Look at her. But why? Asylum records from the 1890s show that certain patients generated substantial correspondence. Families demanding release, lawyers questioning detention, magistrates requesting status updates. If a patient had powerful connections, if their detention was politically sensitive, their sudden death in a fire would trigger investigations the institution couldn't afford. The solution: preserve their record while eliminating context that would reveal why they were there. The 1890 census listed an unnamed female patient under state care. 3 years later, patient 187 is entered as retained, with no diagnosis, no name, just a note that her admission was by county order, but her care was assigned to Dr. Carver personally. State authority, county order, personal supervision. These are administrative contradictions that suggest competing jurisdictions, legal disputes, or circumstances where normal procedures didn't apply. One historical parallel: political dissidence. In the 1880s and 90s, it wasn't uncommon for inconvenient people, labor organizers, journalists who knew too much, women who inherited property their families wanted, to be declared insane and institutionalized. If such a person died in a suspicious fire, their supporters would demand investigations. Better to preserve evidence that they were properly documented, while destroying evidence of who else was there, how they were treated, and why they couldn't be released. But that doesn't explain the photograph, or the note, or why Dr. Carver felt compelled to write, I am not responsible for this. Unless he wasn't trying to protect the institution. Unless he was trying to protect himself from whatever happened to patient 187 before the fire. The most revealing aspect of this case isn't what's documented, it's what isn't. After the fire, there was no official inquiry into the missing records. No investigation into why 42 names had been chemically erased from a ledger that survived intact. No questions about the absent index book or burial registry. The county magistrate raised objections. He resigned in protest. His concerns were filed and forgotten. The state attorney general declined to intervene. The county sheriff concluded it was just fire damage, despite physical evidence proving otherwise. And within 6 months, the asylum site was cleared. The foundation filled in, and the land sold to private buyers. That speed, that efficiency in erasing not just records but physical evidence, suggests coordination. Someone wanted this case closed quickly, quietly, and permanently. Compare this to the Strafford County fire, which triggered a state board of health investigation, public hearings, and detailed reporting. Or the Colney Hatch fire in 1903, which led to inquests, reform legislation, and architectural reviews of asylum safety nationwide. Our fire generated a 2-page report and silence. The pattern suggests that whatever happened at that asylum, whatever patient 187 represented, was sensitive enough that multiple levels of government cooperated to bury it. Not through spectacular cover-up, but through bureaucratic indifference. By simply not asking questions. By accepting obvious lies about destroyed records. By letting protesters resign, rather than answering their concerns. This is how institutional memory is controlled. Not through conspiracy, but through coordinated lack of curiosity. And it worked. For over a century, this case existed only as scattered documents in different archives. The magistrate's report in county records. The federal census data in Washington. The surviving ledger transferred to state custody and buried in restricted access storage. No one connected them. No one asked why a ledger from a destroyed asylum had been professionally edited before the fire. No one questioned why 44 people died but only one name survived. Until forensic document analysis revealed what had been hidden in plain sight. Evidence that someone with authority, resources, and motive had systematically erased 42 human beings from the historical record while carefully preserving one. But preserved for whom? And to prove what? The note hidden in the binding, "I am not responsible for this," suggests Dr. Carver knew patient 187's presence would eventually be questioned, that someone would find this ledger, see this entry, and ask why she alone survived the erasure. He was creating a defense, not against accusations of negligence in the fire, against accusations of something else entirely. Something that happened before the fire. Something connected to a patient held under state authority, photographed in an isolation cell, charged to special accounts, and kept off census records. What did they do to patient 187? And did she survive the fire? Because here's the detail that investigators noted but never followed up on. The county coroner documented 44 bodies recovered from the ruins. The ledger, even after erasure, shows evidence of 43 admission entries based on page sequence and binding structure. 44 bodies. 43 entries maximum. One extra death, or one person who was never officially admitted at all. The truth lies somewhere in what's missing. The ledger now sits in climate-controlled darkness, handled only by researchers with specialized clearance. Patient 187's entry remains visible, untouched by the erasures that consumed everything around it. The photograph, damaged, fragmentary, has been digitally preserved. Dr. Carver's note, discovered in the binding, has been transcribed and filed. And that's all we have. One entry, one photograph, one cryptic disclaimer. Everything else is absence. Modern forensic analysis can tell us how the erasures were made. Chemical agents, physical scraping, professional rebinding. It can tell us the timeline, weeks before the fire, with one page inserted afterward. It can identify the handwriting, date the materials, map the gaps. But it cannot tell us who patient 187 was, or why she was retained, or what Dr. Carver wasn't responsible for. What we know is this. In 1893, during an economic collapse that destroyed institutions and decimated budgets, someone with state authority held a woman in a county asylum under conditions requiring isolation, special provisions, and absolute secrecy. When the asylum burned, whether by accident or design, someone edited the admission ledger to erase 42 patients while preserving her entry. Someone photographed the cell where she was kept and hid that photograph in the ledger as evidence. Someone wrote a note disclaiming responsibility and concealed it in the binding. And someone ensured that official investigations never asked the questions these documents demand. The erasures weren't meant to hide patient 187. They were meant to hide everyone else, to eliminate context that would explain why she was there, who put her there, and what was done to her. By removing all surrounding information, they made her entry meaningless. A name without context. A diagnosis that isn't a diagnosis. A presence that couldn't be questioned because there was nothing to question against. But they preserved enough to serve a purpose. If anyone ever asked whether the asylum maintained proper records, there it was. One entry. Proof of documentation. And if anyone ever tried to hold someone accountable for patient 187's detention, there was the note, "I am not responsible." What happened in that asylum? We don't know. What happened to patient 187? The records are silent. Did she die in the fire? 44 bodies were recovered, but only 43 can be accounted for even in the erased ledger structure. That math suggests someone was there who was never officially admitted. Someone whose death would go unrecorded because their life was never recorded. Or someone who didn't die at all, who was removed before the fire, transferred, released, disappeared into another institution under another name. The erasures make all possibilities equally plausible and equally unprovable. In 2018, a researcher requested access to asylum records from 1893. The state archivist pulled the ledger, logged the request, supervised the examination. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. The researcher noticed the erasures, requested forensic analysis. The analysis revealed chemical treatments, page replacements, hidden documents. The researcher filed questions with the State Historical Society. Had anyone investigated this case? Were there supplementary records? Was there any documentation explaining the erasures? The Historical Society searched its files. No investigation. No supplementary records. No explanation. The ledger had been transferred to state custody in 1894, 1 year after the fire. Accessioned without comment. Stored without question. For over a century, it sat in archive boxes, examined occasionally by researchers who noted the fire damage, but never looked closely enough to see the erasures. Because that's how institutional memory works. Documents survive, but their meaning is lost. Evidence persists, but no one asks the right questions. The archive remembers everything and understands nothing. Patient 187 existed. The records prove it. She was held under state authority in conditions requiring special containment. She was documented deliberately while everyone around her was erased. And someone wanted evidence of her detention to survive, even as they made that evidence incomprehensible. We will never know her name. We will never know her crime or her diagnosis, or whether she was genuinely ill or simply inconvenient to someone powerful enough to make her disappear into the asylum system. We will never know if she died in the fire or if she survived, transferred to another institution under another designation, lost in a system designed to lose people. All we know is what the ledger preserves. One entry, standing alone in an ocean of erasure. Patient 187. Retained. No further information available. The archive is silent on what was done to her, but the erasures around her entry scream with what cannot be asked. In 1893, 43 people officially existed in a county asylum. 44 bodies were pulled from the ruins, and only one name survived the fire. Not because she was lucky, but because someone decided she alone could never be allowed to completely disappear. The question isn't why her record survived. The question is what she knew that required 42 other people to be erased from history to protect it. The ledger offers no answer. Only the silence of a page preserved between erasures. Evidence without context, memory without meaning, a name that isn't a name marking a space where history chose to look away. The dreadful record, case file closed. Archive status, restricted access. Questions, unresolved. Some records survive not to reveal the truth, but to mark where the truth was buried.